solution. It seems that the circularization on the module Casper was unsuccessful. For the follow control, 101 hours, 50 minutes ground elapsed time. Manned Spacecraft Center Director Dr. Christopher C. Quest Jr. just came back into the control center after having attended a meeting by management people in one of the back rooms, and the situation is go for landing.
Evening, folks. Hope you're all well. Sorry if I confused you there with my choice of music. It's a radio station called Fmea FM. It's a very interesting one. What it does is it plays a lot of the lunar audio, and it kind of puts music in the background of it. It's kind of nice to have on in the background. It's kind of unusual. But anyway, I hope you're all well. Let's make sure I have everything right. Okay, good. All right. So yeah, I hope you're all well. This evening it will be our last lecture. We'll finish up this evening. So what we're going to do is we're going to primarily just go over exam papers. But before I do that, what I want to do is I've just put a couple of slides together just to talk a bit about an open book exam. I know we talked about it on Saturday, but I want to spend a bit more time doing that. And then I'll go through examples, and then what I'll do is I'll go back over previous papers. And what I will do is, if I was writing that as an open book exam, what would it look like? So that's what we'll do. I will put these slides up on Moodle. As soon as I finish with them, I'll put them up. Okay, so I'm sure hopefully you've all had a chance maybe at this stage to log on to some of the dry runs. If you haven't, make sure you do that. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, there was an email came out there last week from the exams office just about the exam process. I don't know, we talked about it, we went through it there the other day, but just make sure you go through some of the dry runs yourself. Just getting used to that. Make sure you download Microsoft Lens and play with that. Make sure you understand how to generate a PDF document as well. So what I want to talk about now is really just the idea of an open book exam. What is it? And specifically talk about it in the context of the OE module. But you can apply what I'm saying here to any of the other topics. You can see here by how you structure an open book exam, how you can then interpret the other exam papers as well. So like I said, I'll go through these, and I'll upload then onto Moodle as well. I suppose to kind of start, where does all this stuff come from? And some of you may be familiar and some of you may not be familiar with, there are different levels of learning out there, and they kind of correspond to somebody going on a level 6 program or a level 7 program or level 8, all the way up to PhD program. And the whole idea of learning and the way things are structured, they're there to kind of challenge you at a kind of greater level. And most people will be very familiar with the idea of a closed book exam. And a closed book exam, for the most part, is trying to get you to recall information. And what you might notice is as you move up into level 8 and to level 9, there are less written exams there. It's more about interpretation of something. It's more about developing something new. It's more about challenging assumptions. It's about doing something more than just remembering something. So there are different levels out there. And whether go back to your leaving cert, where the job primarily was trying to remember something and kind of regurgitate something. Whereas as you get into more trying to understand something or apply something, then you get into trying analyzing something or evaluating right up to level 8 or level 9 or level 10, where you're creating something, you're developing something completely new. So just to be aware, I suppose there are different levels out there in terms of learning. That's why, for example, you could do there's a module on the level 7 BAPBO program, for example, on clinical research. We go into the level 8, there's a module on clinical research as well. And it's not that the content is the same, but the expectation is different. I deliver modules around Lean and Six Sigma from level 6, for example, all the way up to level 9. And in some cases, I'm using similar materials. In some cases, I'm talking about the same principle. I'm talking about lean principles, or I'm talking about, cause and effect. But the level that I'm going into is much deeper as you go up along. So that's a kind of a useful background, and most of you may be familiar with that, but it's important just to understand that. So let's talk a bit about open book exams and what are they, and what people's misconceptions about them, and then let's look at them specifically in terms of OE and look at the modules then. So what is it? So you can read it there, you're kind of yourself, but an open book exam is very much around, it's an assessment method designed in a way that allows the student to refer, obviously, to either notes or memory aids, textbooks, access to the material. So that's kind of a given, that you will have access to your notes, whatever you have around you will have access to the internet. You shouldn't have access to other people. Okay, that's the important thing, but you will have access to other notes. And you can use them, I suppose, in different situations. You can use them, some people will actually, under normal circumstances, will have open book exams. So it's not necessarily unusual. Obviously, in this case, we're using open book exams because of the current situation. But the purpose of an open book exam is really that as a lecturer, you can devise questions that really require students to answer in a kind of a more critical and more analytical way. And it can, to an extent, encourage somebody to look more about the application of something as opposed to just the traditional remembering something. That's really what you're trying to move away from. And sometimes I suppose people might have misconceptions about open book exams. People say, well, sure, this is going to be easy. Like, I'll have all the notes around me, so where's the problem here? So all I do is I just type it into Google or whatever, and it'll give me the answer straight away. People have this idea that I won't have to study because I'll just be able to refer to my notes and I'll be able to find the answers. Or I can just copy it straight from the internet, for example. Or the more material I put in there, all the better. And also, I think people feel like, well, I'll probably finish early because I'll be able to just pull things from the notes around me, for example, as well. And, they're not really like that. I suppose the big thing, I suppose, that it is important is you have to study as if it's a closed book exam. You have to understand the principles, and then the exam on the day is more about the application. It's more about how you're going to use that some of that information. Okay, so what I would say first of all is study as if it is a normal closed book exam. By all means, you can have all the notes around you, but study as if it is a closed exam. So if I was sitting down with a lecturer, which, I've gone through some of these slides with the lecturers, and I said I would share them with yourselves as well, is, what do you do when you're trying to design a closed book exam? The most important here is you're trying to design it such that, a student will apply or make use of the information rather than locate the information. Okay, so if I emphasize that, the traditional view could almost be, can I find the answer in the notes? Or can I rewrite what they're looking for, the principles, the idea? It's not about that. It's more about, given the fact that you know it, given the fact that you have access to the content, how can I apply that knowledge? How can I make use of it? And we'll see examples now in a second. So it's more about, assessing the interpretation and the application of the knowledge. It's more about using something. It's more about doing something with it rather than just recalling the skill itself. And sometimes what you can do is you can use maybe more like case studies. You can design questions that are more example based. And then what you're really trying to do is you're trying to get somebody to analyze something or, come to different conclusions based on what's there, rather than just regurgitating what's there. Again, lots of words on this page, but we kind of go through it slowly. Again, if somebody is trying to design an open book exam, One option is to design it, which is a bit more around some sort of a problem-based scenario. So you might give somebody a load of data, for example. You might give them a load of information. And then what you might say was, build a project plan or develop, some sort of a clinical research plan or do something with the information. And again, in a case like that, you just can't go off and just fire that information into Google and find the answer. So it's very much around, interpreting, I suppose, what you're reading or what you're seeing, making sense of something. That's what's important. And when you think about it, that's a far more useful type of question than just purely regurgitating something. So it might be looking at what does the data show. If you look at the moment, any of you who's kind of study a lot of the data around COVID-19 and all of that, you might be looking at what is the trend, what is the data actually telling us, for example. So if you were doing a question related to that, it's really about the ability to apply something, analyze something, create, synthesize. Now, obviously, there's a level in terms of how far you go. You're not going to jump up to a level 8 or a level 9 question. You still have to maintain it at the same level as it was before. So you're not asking somebody to have a greater, more in-depth knowledge of anything. You're not doing that, but you are asking them to understand it and apply it, for example, as well. And there is a type of a question out there. It's called a Socratic question. And this is a little bit theoretical for a second, but you'll find it a little bit useful to try and get your head around how could that question be asked a little bit different. It's called a Socratic question after Socrates. And it's just another way of asking a question. And I want to show you a few examples now in a second, and just that you see where the idea comes from. Because I want you to be able to look at any past paper, doesn't matter what program or what module it comes from, and you'd be able to figure out fairly quickly, if that was an open book exam, what would be the typical type of question you'd be asked, okay? I mentioned that it's a thing called a Socratic questioning. I came across this recently and I thought it appropriate. This thing called the Socratic method, as opposed to the sarcastic method. The Socratic method is very much around challenging. It's about assumptions. It's about being a bit more reflective. That's really what it's trying to do. So rather than asking somebody pure theory, where does it come from? It's about, a bit more about understanding where do things come from and challenging that kind of stuff. And it's about looking at the application of it. And this idea of Socratic questions, and the next slide gets more practical where I go into examples. Really, the idea behind asking this type of a question is really about, imagine if we were talking about lean, or we're talking about Six Sigma, or we're talking about Pew matrix or anything like that. One option is just say, what's a Pew matrix? What's a cause and effect diagram? What are lean principles? But they're too straightforward. You Google the answer and straight away you have that. They're closed questions. But what we find is this idea of a Socratic question. It's more around, clarifying thinking. So for example, one thing you'll find a lot of is you'll find a lot of people now saying, give me an example of something. So if I'm talking about 5S, or I'm talking about SMED, for example, rather than saying, what is 5S? I'll be saying, explain what 5S is by use of an example. So I'll be looking for examples. Could you explain this further? So there might be something where you ask somebody to explain something in a bit more detail. Let's have a look. So there could be one around, challenging assumptions. Is this always the case? There might be a statement there about something. You could look at assumptions. What assumptions are being made, for example? How would you prove this or disprove this? Now, again, some of these types of questions are relevant for what we're talking about. Some of them are probably a little bit beyond what we're trying to do. But the idea of looking for examples will be very typical of what you'll see now in a second. For example, looking for evidence. Why do you say that? How do you know that? For example, what evidence is out there? Somebody could look at alternatives. Are there alternative ways of looking at something? You could look at the implications, for example. So what would be the impact of doing something? what would be the impact of not doing something? So for example, if we were talking about Six Sigma, and we were talking about a problem statement, what would be the impact if you clearly didn't define a problem? What would be the impact if you clearly didn't diagnose a root cause, for example? Those kinds of things you might be thinking of. What would happen if you didn't do a proper validation? What would happen if you didn't inspect, for example? And there's a few other ones there as well. So you can kind of get a sense of some of these are examples that people will start to use now. Not all of them, but some of them. So let's look at a few examples here. Okay, yeah, sorry, there's one more thing I wanted to mention as well. These kinds of questions, and I've pulled these from different papers, from different places. They're not related to OE. But sometimes you can have this type of, short questions, or what I would consider very closed questions. So for example, what does QMS stand for? Quality Management System. That would be very much a closed question. That's something that you can often Google straight away. So you wouldn't really be seeing something like that. That's kind of too obvious. What is the ISO standard for risk, for example? Name 2 notified bodies. Those are very direct questions for which you can find the answer pretty much straight away. What is an FDA non-conformance, also known as 483, this kind of stuff. Define and explain the term GMP. So if you go back and look at a lot of the previous exam papers where somebody's asking you to define something, or what is something, what is a quality manual, list 4 reasons for product recall, those things would be considered very much closed questions. So you should see a lot less of those in the papers going forward. So let's have a look at a couple of examples here, and then let's go over a lot of the exam papers. What you'll find with a lot of the questions I tend to ask, they tend to be very much open book questions in the first place. In a lot of cases, I tend to look for examples. So even a lot of the questions that I would have posed in the past would work as open book exam questions as well. So mine aren't going to be that much different. I don't have a whole range of these short questions. I don't do that kind of stuff. So a lot of them tend to be very much open book style. And what I've done is I've just pulled a couple of them together, and I'm just going to show you them here. And what I want you to look at is, I'm going to get you to look at maybe some of the examples on the right-hand side and say, well, if you were going to write that as a closed book question, which things would you use? Would you say, give me an example of, what would happen if something happened, etc. So let's look at this question. And then what I want to get you to do is just type some stuff into the chat box here for a second. So this is just a question in the areas of lean. It says transportation is one type of waste identified in an enterprise. Identify using examples 3 other wastes that could be observed in the pharmaceutical industry. So the first part is transportation is one type of waste identified in an enterprise. So I'm telling you that. So outline using examples. So it's already designed to be kind of an open book. 3 other wastes that could be observed in the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, so it is very much around using an example. Now, if I said name 3 other wastes that could be observed in the pharmaceutical industry, you could go straight away and you could Google that, and you could come back with, inventory and movement and motion and all the other ones. So that would be too easy. So you can see in this case, it is pretty much an open book question already. Can anybody give any examples there where any of these ones, what else could I ask about by looking at one of these examples on the right that might make that more of an open book exam question? So defects reduced by QBD and by quality, by design. Let me think about that one, Sarah. Well, John is, first of all, is saying using Tim Wood. How would you reduce the waste? Yeah, you could come up with possible solutions in terms of how you could reduce the waste. Could definitely be one. Let me just go back to Sarah's there. Defects reduced by quality by design. Damien explained rework as a waste. So again, you could get into this whole argument around rework, and some people would say it's value added, and some people would say it's not value added. You know, you could get into that. Kieran is saying, what evidence is there to support that? Again, that would be good. How would you identify the waste? How would you measure it, for example? Yeah, so let's have a look at the other set. So I've two sets here. So let's have a look at these. Are there any alternatives? What's the other side of the argument? What makes your viewpoint better? Who would be affected, for example? What are the implications or the consequences? How does that affect something? What if you were wrong? Why do you think I'm asking you that question? What do you mean, for example? Elaine is saying, give an overview of a process and identify the waste. Give examples of ways to reduce the waste. Exactly. So you can see here that, and Margaret is saying ways to identify the waste in the value stream and how to remove them and control them. Yeah, so you definitely get the idea. Now, again, the thing here to be careful about is, in all the cases, we have to balance it between going too far and making assumptions around somebody's knowledge of the pharmaceutical industry, for example. But you can get the gist here of the idea would be that you have to know the theory and you have to know the principle behind it. But then it's more about the application of it, right? Let's have a look at the second part of the question. Outline the difference between a process map and a value stream map. So you can see in that case, that's very much a kind of a closed book. You know, you can clearly say, you know, process map is just one element of a value stream map, and you map that in more detail. Value stream map always starts and ends with a customer. So that theory is already there. Now it says demonstrate the difference by drawing a value stream map of a typical manufacturing enterprise and including a process map of some element of the enterprise. It's almost kind of giving you an indication of what the answer is. But so you can see in that case, again, it's somewhat, that part of it would be more open. What else do you think you could ask around the second part here, around the, you know, the difference between a process map and a value stream map, that would make that more of an open book question? Because I think the first part is too closed, right? So we couldn't really ask that part of it. But what else could you ask around the difference between our process maps and value stream maps that might be more suitable for an open book exam? So give an example. Okay. Will we be looking for a drawing? I would say yes, John. I think the more, and I'm not looking for works of art here, right? So, you know, a lot of the things we're talking about here, it's good to be able to draw them. So, you know, for example, drawing layouts, drawing things like that, but I'm not looking for a detailed one, and I'm not expecting you to draw it using Visio, or I'm not expecting you to draw it, you know, the way I drew a process flow diagram. Hand drawings are absolutely fine. Kevin is saying we could look at some of the metrics that are captured as part of a value stream map. Katrina is saying looking for similarities between the benefit. You know, definitely the benefit of why would you do a process map as opposed to a value stream map, and vice versa. Hillary is saying how do they help to improve a business? Again, absolutely, you can see there. How do effective process maps help in developing a value stream map? Sorry, how do effective process maps help in developing a value stream map? And contrast and compare the difference between a value stream map and a process flow and give advantages and disadvantages of both. So again, you can see there that absolutely all of those questions are fine. But Nicola, you had a question earlier on. Let me just go back there. So if, for example, we got something like these questions, could we draw from our assignment? Okay, so if you have an assignment that you've submitted, and you want to take, by all means, you can take an example from that. If you decide to cut and paste, for example, the big value stream map that you did, you're not going to get a huge amount of marks for that. You'll get marks for the example, but you won't, to be fair for somebody who's hand drawing it, for example, you're not going to get more marks because you've now presented, an engineering drawing that was done by Jacobs because you've put an extension onto the facility. You won't get more marks for that. But you can use the examples that you have used in your assignment. And what I mean by that is you can refer to them. Don't say, look at my assignment, and don't say that, but the examples you've used in there, you can do that. But like I said, don't copy chunks of it and just stick it into your document. You won't get extra marks for volume, if that makes sense. All right. Again, to be fair for somebody who's drawing this by hand. Okay. All right. But it's a good question. So you can see there in that case, for the most part, that one was fairly open. Let's try another one here. And again, hopefully this kind of process makes sense. So again, this is a typical question that I've asked in one of the previous years. Typical value stream is outlined below. So this is very much like an open book exam already. I'm telling you, this is what a value stream map is. So outline using examples the purpose of a value stream map and distinguish it, how it's different from a process map, and develop a typical example of a value stream map for a pharmaceutical facility. This was actually quite an easy question. Because what I'm doing is I'm already showing you what does the structure look like. And then obviously I'm saying what's the difference, but I wouldn't ask that this time around. And develop a typical example of a value stream map in a pharmaceutical facility. And to be honest, really all you're trying to do here, no, you can't have it again. All you're really doing here is you're editing this and you're putting in some of the key steps within a manufacturing facility. But again, I suppose what I would do there is I would ask something more around interpreting how could you use this, for example, to drive improvement? What would you measure? It's more about the application of it. That would be kind of the idea. That would be the idea in it. Again, let's look at the questions on the right. So can you give me an example? Can you explain further? There could be something in there around some further explanation of how would you solve the problem, where would you start, what would you measure. Kieran is asking the question, in that question, would it have been acceptable to draw the examples from the value stream map in the question? In the question, would it have been acceptable to draw the examples from the value stream map in the question? Not sure that I fully understand that one, Kieran. Natalia is asking a question, don't have a pharma background. Yeah, in this case, I would say, Natalia, that one was fairly easy. I would describe that question as quite easy because if you understood the fundamental steps in terms of, blending or granulation, compression, testing, that's really what I was looking for there. Yeah, for the most part, Nikolai, I tend not to be specific around pharmaceutical questions, or if they are, they're fairly generic. Kieran, I'll come back to yours 1 second. Elaine is saying, identify the key areas for improvement for the value stream map and provide a rationale or an explanation as why you have identified these areas. Yeah, that's a good way of, that's a good question. So again, it's more the broader thought process. Yeah, no, take your time, Kieran, there's no rush. I will put them up, Aidan, on Moodle. I'll put them up afterwards. I didn't put them up there yet, but I'll put them up there later on this evening. Okay. Yeah, okay, good. All right. Again, let's look at the other questions here. Are there any alternatives? What are the other sides of the argument? You could ask the question around what would be the benefit of using a value stream map in this case? Sometimes what happens is you might identify improvements in a couple of areas. And remember, one of the reasons of the value stream map is that you would look at, well, if we improved this step here, what impact would it have in terms of the overall value stream map? and it might say, well, it might make more sense to focus on this other area. So they tend to be more higher level questions as opposed to something very, very specific. Let's see if there's anything else here. The implications or consequences. So you could look at the implications or consequences of not looking at the bigger picture. You know, that could be one. So let's say, for example, you've identified this as a bottleneck, and you didn't look at the implications of the bigger picture. You might find actually you don't need that step at all. So rather than trying to fix it, if you looked at the bigger picture, you might realize actually we don't need to do that step. Let's just get rid of it. So Hillary's asking, will there be more or less questions on the paper than close the book? Yeah, we'll see now in a second. The format is going to be exactly the same. It'll be 5 questions and do 4. So they look very, very similar to the ones we're actually looking at here. So I haven't changed that. Let's see. Let's have a look at 1 or 2 more, then we'll get stuck into the papers as well. I just said I'd pull out a few. This one, describe using a diagram the key elements of a corrective action, preventive action system. Identify which improvement tools and techniques support the CAPA process. Now, this is very much more a closed book. So what I'm asking here is that high level diagram, remember that we kept referring to. Remember there was kind of 2 parts to it, where there was the level 1, level 2 part. Define the problem, evaluate the severity, whether it's level 1, if it's level 1 up here, if it's level 2, it's down here. So if you remember that diagram, really what I'm asking for here is draw that diagram and identify some of the tools that you'd be using. So that would be very much a closed book exam in that one. And so let's see, for example, here, give me an example. Could you explain further? So in this case, you could look at, let's say, for example, we came up with a deviation. Let's say, for example, I described a situation where somebody wrote the wrong piece of data into a batch record or into any document. And I might say, well, if you were applying the CAPA process, which route would you go down, and maybe identify a set of actions? That could be one way of doing it. Elaine has a question there. Give an example of a CAPA and then ask how you would identify the criticality. How would you assess it? What tools would you use? Absolutely. Now that might be a little bit too detailed, because again, I'd be cognizant of not everybody in the class would have familiarity with CAPA. So it's one of those things where you have to be careful you don't go too deep into, but absolutely you could ask that as well. Discuss the importance of correctly identifying a problem statement as part of CAPA and provide an example of a well-written problem statement. So discuss the importance. Again, I wasn't asking specifically here, what are the 3 or 4 elements of a problem statement, which would be very straightforward, but discuss the importance is a little bit more of an open book style. So you're asking somebody the impact of doing it right or the impact of doing wrong, and then provide an example of a well-written problem statement. Again, just to suppose as a point, in the notes, in that case, like there are examples where we've given an example of a problem statement. My gut sense is if I did ask that question again, and I don't think I haven't asked that very specific question there in terms of providing an example, but if somebody just regurgitated what was in the notes, or if somebody wrote an original problem statement, I think it's fair to say you would get more marks for an original problem statement than just regurgitating something. So I think that I would say the more originality you provide in an open book exam, the more marks you're going to get for it. If you just copy stuff here and there, and it's always very obvious if somebody copies something off the web, or even if you write it down directly from the web, you'll know straight away by the use of language, or it's very obvious. So this is more about you putting stuff into your own words and describing the application of it, etc. as well. So in this case, it could be, let me just see, yeah, so it could be around, alternatives. It's more about assumptions. What would happen if you were wrong? So let's say, for example, you looked at a kappa and you made the assumption that this was just a recordable. This is a level 1. This is very simple. But you could ask the question, what would happen if you were wrong? What would happen if you made the wrong assumption about it, for example? What would be the implications? What would be the consequences of making the wrong decision? And so you can see how you can ask it in a slightly different way, okay? Katrina has any example for the problem statement and kappa other than pharma is okay? Yeah, absolutely. Again, like I said before, unless I specifically ask for something in pharma or medical device or life science, any example is fine. Any example is fine. Elaine is saying you could ask, when does an issue become a kappa? What if you just did a correction instead of a preventative action? Yeah, again, I'd say that might be a little bit deeper. Again, it might be based on somebody having previous knowledge or some experience of kappa, but absolutely you're right. That determination to a certain extent is a little bit more based on a bit of experience as well, rather than kind of pure theory. But you're absolutely right in what you're saying, Elaine. I mean, that's another way as well. Yeah, no, I've no issue in terms of it being non-pharma. Again, I suppose the fundamental thing for me here is that if you can understand the principles of Lean and Six Sigma and problem solving, it really doesn't matter where you apply them. And to be honest, if you come up with an example where you can look at a normal day-to-day object and you can describe it using some of the principles, it means you get it, you understand it. And that to me is almost more useful than just regurgitating something in the, in the pharmaceutical industry, or we quote an example that we've talked about in the class. The more original stuff you can come up with, I think in a case like this, I think it's better. And I think you'll get more marks for it. In my module anyway, it might be slightly different than the others. Okay. Okay, I think we've one more, and then what we're going to do is just look at some more papers. These are all coming from the last 2 years' papers anyway. Outline the purpose of failure mode effect analysis. Outline the 3 factors in determining risk in any process. I make life too easy for you. Provide an example of where Fmea can be applied in the pharmaceutical industry. So the purpose of failure mode effect analysis, you just Google that, right? So that's a very straight question. And outline the 3 factors in determining risk in any process. Again, that would be very straight around severity, probability, detectability. That's a very closed question. It's a very direct question. But the other one is a bit different. Provide an example where an Fmea complied in the pharmaceutical industry. And again, that does say the pharmaceutical industry, but really, at this stage, you should all have a reasonable enough knowledge to just understand risk. Fmea is all about risk. So whether it's risk and documentations, etc. as well. Again, Elaine is asking, discuss the pros and cons of the Fmea process. To do that, I suppose to a certain extent, you'd almost need some other comparison. What other tools are out there? And that one might be difficult to do it, but absolutely it's an example of an alternative. And sometimes what you might even call on is risks at the moment. If you look at COVID-19 and, risk and kappas and containing things, and, there's loads and loads of examples out there to look at that idea. Outline the purpose of the control phase in Six Sigma. Again, that's very closed. You'll Google that straight away in the notes. Provide examples of actions that should be considered to sustain the benefits achieved in the project. So that's very much an open book question. So, so let's say, for example, you go off and you implement some sort of an improvement. What would you do to sustain that? And again, I would put focus on the word examples. You know, rather than you just coming up with generic, you need to develop a training plan and you need to communicate it. The stronger the example, you know, make it an assumption. Make an assumption around a project team that has implemented something and reduced waste or improved cycle time or improved right first time, or, you know, think of something, refer back to your assignment, for example. You know, think of, you've all identified improvements. Think about, you know, ways to sustain it as well. Grace is asking the question, am I happy with bullet points? The problem with a bullet point is it can be very high level. I'd prefer more detail, because if I give a bullet, you know, if you give a bullet point as an answer, for example, communicate the plan, you can't really give that full marks because it's just too high level. To me, I suppose you could use bullet points, but I think that would be on the lower scale of marks. Whereas the more you can give me an example, and somebody asked the question earlier on again about drawing, you know, the more you can draw stuff, the more you can, this module is about, you know, examples. So look at the layout of the floor. A lot of you give me layouts of floor plans, or, you know, an example of how you might design a form, or example of how you might design a dashboard or an error proofing device. The more examples like that, and I'm not expecting works of art, but to me that is far better than just purely a bullet point. But I'm going to start off with a bullet point, but I think give me more detail. You know, it doesn't have to be hugely abstract, but, you know, give me an example, I would say. So I would say, Grace, yeah, try and give me more, well, sorry, give me more than a bullet point. By all means, you're right, yeah, a combination would be good. All right. So let's see if any other ones. I think they're the main ones. Anna has a comment here. I'm planning to type the answer in Word. Is it okay to have drawings submitted separately? Absolutely. What you can do is you can type it in, and then you can draw diagrams on pages. Just make sure, for example, that the diagram has, you know, question 2 part A or question 3 part A. That's absolutely fine. And again, I'm not expecting you to combine that diagram into that section in the Word document. As long as they're clearly marked, you can upload them as separate documents. That's absolutely fine. Okay. Okay. So I think that's pretty much it. So what we'll do is let's have a look at a few other quick questions here from papers. And again, what I'm looking at here is I've gone back and looked at papers from 2018 and 2019. And what we do is we'll have a quick look at them, and I'll just explain, you know, the format, and then we'll have a quick look at them, and hopefully you'll get a good sense then really where I'm coming from. So let's start off, I suppose, with the format. So the format I've always used and I continue to use is there are 5 questions there, you do 4. Any 4. They're all the same overall marks. The marking within the questions sometimes can vary, but for the most part, you'll see that each one of them adds up to 25%. A few things I would say, you always get marked on the best 4 questions. Okay, so if you write 5 questions, I'll correct the 5 of them, but you get marks for the 4 best ones, right? So sometimes people say, you know, I have time and I'll do 5 questions and I get corrected on the best 4. I'm not sure that I agree with that strategy. I would say that do 4 questions very well, because if you do a 5th question, some of that work you're going to do is going to be thrown away. It's going to be excluded. So if you do 4 questions and you want to go on and do a 5th question, I would say seriously consider and go back and spend time improving the 4 questions you've already done. Because you'll get marks for those. If you go on to the 5th one, some of that isn't going to, you know, is going to be excluded. Kevin has a question. If I have the process map and the value stream map elements in Excel format, I'm assuming that I can create it in Excel, include it in the work document. Yeah, I suppose you can't really use stuff that you've prepared earlier, for the want of a better word. So think about if you have a value stream map, and let me think about this for a second. If you have a very detailed value stream map that you've already done, and you're going to copy and paste that in, you'll get marks because it's a value stream map, but you won't necessarily get marks because of the level of detail that's in there. Now, the question won't be designed around put in an awful lot of detail. They won't be designed around that. So be careful. Like I said, this isn't about quantity. So for example, you know, there would have been a few cases there where people would have supplemented some of their submissions with loads of drawings and loads of graphs. And sometimes when you see all that graphs, you know the individual didn't do that themselves. So if you include loads of stuff that is somebody else's work, then you really won't get credit for that. So, you know, if you're talking about an improvement and there's graphs in there, you won't get credit for that. So let me just go back. Yeah, and Katrina's point there, they don't always have to be in Word. I mean, and let me just go back to some of these questions here. So yeah, it's try and avoid cutting and pasting loads of stuff. And, you know, the questions won't be around doing detailed value stream maps or very, very detailed process maps. You might have to draw a process diagram, but it has to be fair to somebody who's not going to draw it or doesn't have, who can copy and paste from the internet, for example, because a lot of people will handwrite the documents. So, you know, you can't have a situation where somebody just pulls a chunk off the internet and sticks it into the document and expects to get credit for that. It's more about the application of it. So let me just go back here. So I suppose the point that Kevin is making there, by all means, you could hand draw stuff, no issue whatsoever there. But what I'm saying is that you don't just grab a big chunk of text, or sorry, a diagram and stick it into the answer and expect to get the credit for all of that diagram, for example. You know, so you can do that. Let me just see what else is here. So Elaine is saying if you have a blank template for a value stream map and edit it for the exam with the information, that's, yeah, you could. I mean, to be honest, to draw a value stream map from scratch won't take up a huge amount of time anyway, in terms of what I'm looking for. If I was looking for a value stream map, you could do that. But again, I suppose what I'm saying here is that you get marks for things that you do within the time frame. So if you've loads of things pre-prepared, then there's a fine line in terms of how many marks you get for that, if that makes sense. You know, it's almost like in a cooking class, if you have everything pre-prepared, you know, you are really expected to write and do all of the stuff within the time frame, I suppose. But if you have something like a blank value stream map, that's probably okay. I don't think I have any fundamental problem with that. But if there's a value stream map that's already pre-developed, yeah, that would be different, I think. All right. Sorry, make sure I understand Katrina's. We can't use Excel. Yeah, I mean, if you want to use Excel, if you want to draw a diagram in Excel, you could do it. You could, I mean, you can go into Excel and you can draw a process flow diagram there. But to be fair to somebody who's going to draw it by hand, if you took two process flow diagrams and they were identical, so one person drew it by hand and one person drew it in Excel, you won't get any more marks for drawing it in Excel. So, so again, I have to be fair to everybody. So where the value is in the content, the value is in the discussion, rather than the value in, I typed it into Word, or I drew it in Excel, or I drew it in Visio, for example. Again, you know, we need to be fair to people. Okay. Elaine is saying you won't get less marks for doing it in Visio. You won't, but you won't get any more either, is really what I'm saying. But you won't get less marks. You know, that's okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of questions here. So sorry, let me go back to the question here. So do 4 out of 5 is really what you have to do. Usually what you'll find is that the first couple of questions, maybe the first 3 questions, are usually in the areas of lean, and the others tend to be in the area of kind of Six Sigma and Kappa. There are more opportunities, I think, to ask open book questions around lean rather than Six Sigma. So typically that's what you'll kind of find. Okay, so that's the first one there. Discuss why the activities of inspection, rework, and customer service couldn't be considered non-value. Again, you know, that's kind of an open book. You're discussing something, you're not necessarily stating a fact. Okay, let's have a look at another one. Purpose of a process map. Again, I wouldn't ask that. That one is kind of too straightforward. Identify the key symbols used in a process map. Again, that would be very straightforward. The next part, develop a simple process map of your choice to include inputs, activities, outputs, and documents. Again, you know, that's open book, but that in itself would be probably a little bit too simplistic. I might ask you to do it in a specific area. Construct a value stream map of a typical manufacturing facility, including a typical example of information that could be included in a value stream map. Again, that's open book. Again, that's a fairly easy question, actually. But that's more of an open book one. You know, again, at the moment, I would probably add something else into it than just asking that on its own, because that might be a little bit kind of too straightforward. Let me just jump into some of the other years here. And again, you should have access to all of these exam papers on Moodle. Question 1, this is from 2018. Having a product that has value is one element of a successful business model. Outline the other factors that support a successful business. So this was the diagram that we talked about very early on about, you know, vision, product and service, process, competency, that kind of model, and outline the other factors that support a successful business. Again, that's fairly open. You know, if you talk about outline or discuss or describe, that's a little bit different than define. Define is just, you know, define a waste, define a lean waste. Transport is a lean waste. But discuss, outline, provide an example, discuss using an example. In that case, we're looking for more detail. Describe using an example, the lean principle, make the product flow smoothly to the customer. So in that case, I'm telling you what the principle is, but I'm saying describe using an example. So what I'm looking for there is an example. Provide an example of something flowing in a manufacturing organization and in a service organization. Again, the question might be around you know, what would be the impact if something doesn't flow or if it does flow. And again, I see Anna's comment there as well. You know, if I'm talking about something in pharma, I'm talking about it at a very high level. You know, all of you at this stage should have an idea of how you make a tablet. You know, broadly, what are the steps? And you should have an idea in terms of, you know, the impact of quality and the impact of regulation, just as a principle, without necessarily going in and discussing a regulation or anything like that. But, you know, the key principles of something working and something not working, I think, you know, you should have an idea of that. I'm not going to be asking you something very specific around manufacturing or documentation or anything like that. It's the principle. 18 is asking, if we study the open book parts of previous papers, would this be sufficient revision? That's your decision, 18. I would say no. You know, I mean, you decide obviously what level do you want to go into, but the idea here is to understand the curriculum. And I know it's easier said than done, but just be careful that you don't go into it just from the point of view of just how do I do the exam, so just be careful about that. Study as if it's a closed book exam, but you'll have the advantage on the day that you have stuff around you. I think the thing that will be a little bit different here is if you understand the theory behind it, there are lots of ways around. You can ask questions around the discussion of something and that kind of stuff. But if you understand the theory, you should be absolutely fine around, answering the rest of it. And again, I suppose, if it's a 2-hour exam, time can go very, very fast. So try not to spend an awful lot of time, going around looking for stuff, finding stuff in your notes, Googling stuff, whatever it is, you have to be prepared. Be careful about that. Okay, let's have a look at a couple more here. Question 3 in this one. Poke-yoke is a method to error-proof a product or a process. Outline the concept and provide examples of error-proofing devices. Okay, so you'll find this would be very typical of the way I'll ask the question, because just asking what is poke-yoke or what is SMED or what is 5S is a bit simplistic in one sense. You will find in a lot of cases I'll be looking for examples, and those kinds of ideas are very suitable for open book exams because it's around an idea or it's the application of something. Nikolai is saying, am I right in saying it's a 3-hour exam? I think you're right. I just can't remember off the top of my head, but I think you're right. Yeah, Nuala is saying yes as well. Yeah, I think the ones in TUD that we do, I think they're 2 hours. Yeah, it says 3 hours. Yeah, you're right. So Gillian is asking, how many examples do we have to give? I would say 1 or 2, but it's really, I suppose, about the quality of them. In that case, I suppose it says provide examples. Katrina is asking, can you give a rough idea of the length of an answer expected? So let's see, can we answer that question? Let's go back to the first one, for example. If you were answering the first part there, question 1, 10 marks, having a product that has value is one element of successful business model. Outline the other factors that support a successful business. So, and let me jump to the slide because that question is a slightly, I don't ask that one too often. Okay, let me go to this question here. So this, what we're referring to is this slide here. So kind of a successful business. And again, if you read the question, sometimes I'm giving you an indication here. So really what I'm looking for here is around discussing this model. I said, sorry, let me just go back to the question a second. Having a product that has value is one element of a successful business model. Outline the other factors that support a successful business. So we're saying here that, having a product, the second one there, having a product that is of value is one part of a successful business model. So really what I would be looking for there is, what I'm kind of saying is, I'm giving you this part. I'm saying having a product of value is important. And then what I'm saying is that outline or discuss the other elements that were important. So really what I'd be looking for here is that I'd be looking for a couple of sentences around vision, explain why vision is important. And you might give an example of vision. I would explain why it's important to have good processes and give examples, maybe someone like Amazon or, think of a good process. I'd explain why it's important for people to have competencies. And each one of these, I'm talking about a couple of sentences. I'm not talking about a huge amount. I would look at, why is culture very, very important, for example, in an organization. So to answer that part of the question, I'm talking about at least half a page and maybe up to a page, something of that order is really what I'd be looking for. And like I said, the more you can supplement it with examples, it just makes it far more real as opposed to just theory. So let's look at the other part here. Describe using an example the lean principle, make the product flow smoothly to a customer in a tight sequence. Provide an example of something flowing. So really, I suppose what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about a couple of paragraphs of, something flowing, whether that's traffic, whether that's flow of information. And, if you can describe that in I would say half a page, that's at least half a page, should I say. So that whole answer to that whole question there is at least a page to a page and a half, I would say. And whether that's handwritten or a Word document, that's kind of hard to say, but I would say, I suppose if you look at it in terms of handwritten, it's at least a handwritten page anyway, at least, probably a page and a half to answer that question, is what I'm looking at. You could write 3 or 4 pages, but you may not necessarily get an awful lot more marks for it. See, it all depends on your ability to answer the question. Sometimes people can write pages and pages, but they actually say very, very little. So, hopefully that gives you an indication. Again, a lot of cases you might be drawing a diagram, and a diagram, could be half a page or a page, depending on how big you draw it. But I would say most cases when you're describing something, I'd say about a half a page of text would be fairly typical, I think, that would describe it. Each one of the individual sections I'm talking about here, something of that order. Okay. Again, let's keep that question in mind as we look at question 3 here. Poke-yoke is a method to error-proof a product or process. Outline the concept and provide an example. So, I might describe what poke-yoke is. It's an error-proofing device. It's designed such that an error wouldn't be allowed to enter into a process, or if it did come in, what it would do is it would stop you progressing on, or worst case, it would come up with an example. And then what I would do is I would pick an example of some sort of an error-proofing device. So whether it's a password, whether it's some sort of a control system, whether it's some sort of an inspection process, think of an example and just describe that example. And in some cases, for example, you might draw a diagram. So Elaine is saying there, say a die for setting up a machine. So you might draw a diagram of something that shows an example of an error-proofing device. Something that won't allow you to do something, anything like that. So the more, for me, like diagrams add an awful lot of value in terms of explaining something here. Bruna is asking, could the example be something that happened based on our own experience? Absolutely, that's fine as well. Again, just don't give me drawings from Jacobs Engineering or Fluor or Fluor. I want it to be your own work, but by all means, you can talk about that example as well. So in that case, there could be half a page of text, and there could be a diagram, maybe example as well. Outline a technique that's used to trigger or communicate the need for additional materials. Provide an example to support your discussion. Again, I'm talking about Kanban here. And, outline a technique. So you describe what Kanban is, what's the methodology, how it would work, and provide an example. Yeah, so you could provide an example. Again, it's any kind of an example. So, like we talked about with the supermarket, which you might have some sort of a material replenishment system. You might have a Kanban, which is a board you use for shift handover, or a board to communicate something, for example. Any kind of an example like that would be absolutely fine. And again, like you said, drawing diagrams in this case just absolutely supports this idea, which again, I keep coming back to this idea that the more you draw this on a piece of paper, I think it's easier as well. It's very hard to scribble on a PC, as in within Excel. So by all means, if you want to draw it in Excel, if you want to draw it in Word, if you want to draw diagrams, that's absolutely fine. whatever you're more comfortable with. Like I said, you won't get more marks for it. Let's have a look at one or two more in that kind of space. So we looked at that. So this is from 2019. Allowing information, materials, or product to flow is an important principle. Outline using an example how the concept of 5S could help improve flow in a typical service organization. So again, I'm not asking you what is 5S, that's kind of too obvious, but it's more about the application of it. So how can you use 5S, for example, to improve the flow? So the design of a supermarket, the design of a car park, the design of a farm, for example. You're buying something online, you're buying something on Amazon. What you're doing is you're describing the flow, is really what you're doing. And again, you can see where more of a answering this as a process flow diagram or answering this as a diagram itself might be a little bit easier, or describing some sort of an example out there would be fine. Outline how the concept of SMED could be used to improve one of the following. Again, I'm giving you a choice here. Production shift handover of information in any industry or anywhere. Equipment changeover from one product to another. So, in this case, what you might even do is just give a simple example. So think about SMED. What do I need to do beforehand? What do I need to do during that interaction, during that downtime? What can I do afterwards, for example? So if I was answering that question, what I might do is I would describe what SMED is about in terms of, looking at all the steps, looking at what you do beforehand, afterwards, etc. as well, and then probably giving a very simple example. So a shift handover sheet, any kind of a changeover document, anything like that would be an example. Kieran is demonstrate understanding and provide visual examples of application as much as text-based for pretty much everything here. Yeah, no, I think that's a fair assumption, Kieran. I think what I'm saying here is that you can answer a lot of these questions by drawing diagrams, and you can describe it in text. But what you can do is you can draw diagrams as well, or you can draw it. And the more of that you do, I think it supports your answers, because the more it demonstrates it. And like I said, this is not an exam in technical drawing, but sometimes it's easier to just draw a picture of something rather than necessarily describing something. Think of poke-yoke, for example. And if you're trying to describe a poke-yoke device, it's easier to draw it. Think of SMED, for example. Think of a Kanban. It's much easier to draw a diagram, of a notice board, of a handover board, of a changeover board. And that's why I'm saying that you're not necessarily going to go off and find those online. You could go off and you could find a really fancy board. No, I understand what you're saying, Kieran. But it's more, and it's your work. You could find an example online of a really fancy Kanban board, but if you just copy that and just stick that in yourself, you're not going to get as many marks for original thought, is really what I'm saying. But yeah, I mean, the more you can supplement it with diagrams, I think in this case it helps to support your answer. Okay, so let's have a look at the kind of the Six Sigma type questions. And you can see in that case, most of them, they tend to be 3 questions in terms of lean. Six Sigma is based on 5 key phases. Outline using examples the fundamental activities that should be considered when initiating or defining a Six Sigma project. Discuss the importance of accurate data and measurement in your answer. So again, I'm not necessarily saying, what's the define phase, what's the measure phase. In some cases, I may have asked it in the past, but it's unlikely I'd be asking that this time around. It's more about give us an example, talk about the importance of it, that kind of stuff. Bruna has a question there about Kanban. Is it only visual, or can be something else to trigger an action. You're absolutely right. I mean, Kanban can be anything. It can be olfactory, it can be gustatory, it can be auditory. Think of a smell, for example. You can use Kanban, you can use sense of smell as a Kanban, as a trigger. The example we were talking about the other day, remember Lush, where we were talking about it in the concept of 5S. So if you walk down Grafton Street during normal times, and you walk down to the bottom of Grafton Street, all of a sudden you get hit with this smell, a nice smell, from Lush. Some of you may be very familiar with the store. So they sell bath bombs, and they sell shampoos and all this type of stuff. And what they do is they use that smell as a trigger. They use that smell as a trigger for you to go into the store. So absolutely, it could be like that. It could be touch. It could be sound, for example. It could be an alarm, for example. That's a Kanban. If you think of siren from an ambulance, siren from a guard car, that's Kanban. It's a trigger to say get out of the way. Flashing lights, Elaine is saying, sounds, they're all Kanbans. Anything that elicits a response or gives you an indication of something. So if you see a blue light, from an ambulance, that's a Kanban to say, just get out of the way. There's something more important going on, So to answer your question, absolutely, you can use anything like that. And anything that you can defend is reasonable as well, So if you can come up with something, and you can argue the case, that's a Kanban. Damien is asking, is an IP check alarm a Kanban? An IP check. Damien, just define what you mean by IP there, just to make sure I understand it. Is it an in-process check, I presume? Is it a Kanban? Yeah, it is. Yeah, again, it's just a trigger. It's there. It's a flag to remind you to do something. So absolutely, that's a Kanban as well. Kanbans can manifest itself in lots of different situations. The design of something. 5S arguably is a Kanban as well. It's designed in a certain way as well. Okay, so you can see in question 4 there, it's around the discussion, the importance of accurate data. Again, if any of you are watching the news these days, if you're watching all of the different press briefings, the amount of fake data that's out there, even from bigger institutions. Stanford had a big trial there recently, and it turned out to be really badly done, and all the data was totally discredited, and there's a lot of that stuff going out there. So you could talk about the importance of inaccurate data. What would be the impact of Six Sigma project if it wasn't defined properly, if you didn't measure it properly, if you didn't come up with the proper root cause, for example. Second part, describe the purpose of a cause and effect diagram in analyzing information. Provide a worked example. So again, I just wouldn't say what is a cause and effect diagram. I'd say look at it in the context of give me an example. Question 5, outline the purpose of FMEA. Outline 3 factors in determining the risk and provide an example where it could be applied. So I think we looked at this one. So again, you could see in that case, that's more of a closed question. Let's look at a few more here that are related to this is from 2019. Data integrity is an important factor in the measure phase. Outline typical activities carried out in the measure phase. Discuss the impact on the project if the measure phase is not completed successfully. So the last part around the impact would be a bit more like an open book. Outline the typical activities. If I was looking for examples maybe of, I might say, think of a typical project and give examples of the things you would measure within that project. That might be a bit more open book. Describe the concept of TRIZ and identifying a solution to a problem. Provide examples where the concept has been implemented. Again, that's a little bit closed book. What I've done before, I don't think I'm kind of doing it at the moment, but I would pose a problem, and I might sometimes ask somebody, come up with a solution to solve that problem based on Free's principles. But if I was doing that, I would have given you, the sheet that has all of the principles on it. But again, it would be more around the application of something. Or maybe what I would do is I would say, pick a typical object, a chair, a table, a wetsuit, a car, and I might say, well, identify certain aspects of that object that are based on Tree's principles. That might be a more of an open book style as well. Question 5, describe using a diagram the key elements of corrective action. Again, that's just draw the diagram. That would be closed book. Identify which improvements. So we've looked at this one already. Discuss the importance of correctly defined problem statement. Again, that's more open book. Provide an example would be okay as well. And let's look at one more and then we'll finish up in the next few minutes. Yeah, question 4 in this one, 2018. The objective of this project is to improve the overall yield of our product X as quickly as possible. Discuss the deficiencies in this statement. What additional information would be required to make this a valid problem statement? Rewrite the statement in a more appropriate manner. Again, probably a little bit easy in the sense that you could go back and you could refer to the notes to understand what's wrong with this. What's wrong with this is, it needs to be quantified. So, what product are you talking about? What's the issue? What's the extent of it, for example, as well? But again, you can see it's slightly more open book. Describe the purpose of measure and analyze phases of Six Sigma, and describe a tool and a technique that could be used in both of these. So that would be very much closed book. That would be you just find the answer in the notes. What's the purpose of measure? What's the purpose of analyze? Describe a tool or a technique that could be used. So that one wouldn't be appropriate. I'd have to change that. Again, it might be around the impact of doing something right or doing something wrong, or it might be about using an example of a tool, Pew matrix, cause and effect. Give an example of how you would use the tool, for example. And again, what I would say is just to emphasize the point, I think I would be giving more marks for original ideas. So remember the Pew matrix. There's an example in there where I've completed the Pew matrix in the case study we looked at. If you just copy and paste that Pew matrix into a Word document and said, there you go, that's plagiarism. Because what you're doing is you're stealing my content and you're expecting me to give you marks for my work. So in that case, that would be kind of, you wouldn't get marks for that. What I'd be looking for is you to construct an example. Okay. TRIZ is a method to identify potential solutions. A Pew matrix is a tool to identify the preferred solution. Outline with the aid of an example how these tools can identify the most appropriate solution to address the root cause. So that's actually kind of an open book. That would be an open book type of a question. I'm really saying TRIZ gives you an answer, but I'm saying, give me an example of that. And he's asking the question, any chance to get a list of topics for the exam? That's kind of the curriculum, and without being, I'm not going to tell you what's coming up in the exam. What I'm saying is these are the areas. Yeah, I think it's just Madeline has a problem, but it should be okay. Yeah, it looks like it's okay. But to your question, Anna, I mean, really, the answer to that is really the curriculum. So I'm not going to be specific around focusing on this stuff for the exam. That wouldn't be appropriate. Yeah, it looks like the sound is okay. She might be okay. Discuss the importance of risk assessment in corrective action, preventative action. Provide an example of how risk assessment could be applied to the pharmaceutical industry. That one is, again, a bit more specific. I may have covered a bit more in that particular year in that case as well. But you can see it's around, discussing the importance of something as well. Okay, I think hopefully that gives you a reasonable indication. Just I suppose as a question, does that give you a reasonable indication in terms of what an open book question will look like in this module anyway? Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Okay, good. So I suppose really what you can do is, by all means, go back and look at past papers. But that slide that I put up there earlier on, I think this one, this might be a useful exercise for yourselves to go back and look at the questions that I have, the closed book questions that you have, and then pose some of these questions here. So can you find an example of something? If you were asked to explain something, so it's almost rewrite that question in your head of what would that look like if it was an open book question. And some cases it makes sense, some cases this idea of Socratic questioning might go into too much detail. And I'll get to the comments there now in 2 seconds. But pose the question a little bit. What could it do? Are there alternatives? What would be things like the impact? They're usually alternatives as well. Martina's question, will we have the assignment results before the exams? I'm working my way through it at the moment. One of the things I mentioned before about not necessarily publishing assignment grades is, if I have somebody who's borderline and I need to find an extra mark, that's sometimes where I go back and I relook at the assignment and see, can I find something somewhere? If I publish the grade, there's very little that I can do around changing the grade, or sorry, changing the result. So no, they're all in good shape. I think they're all pretty much on the money, so I'm not seeing anything fundamentally wrong. I haven't gone through all of them yet, but they're all working out fairly okay. But that's kind of my logic. I was going through. I'm obviously lecturing in a lot of different courses at the moment, and I think I've something like 1,000 assignments and exams to correct in this semester. So this semester tends to be kind of busy, but they'll all get done. Don't worry about that. John has a question there. I know you're saying that there won't be too much of a difference between past papers, but there will. A lot of the statements that were in the papers will not be removed. These would have been a good start to getting points, and now we will have to move away from this to more abstract. I know, yeah, I mean, part of it, to be honest, John, part of it is given what's happened. That's a factor, but they shouldn't be that fundamentally different. A lot of cases, what you will find is embedded in a lot of the questions. People will ask for, an explanation of something or an example of something. The piece, I suppose, that's going to be missing in the question is around, define this, or what is a validation plan, or what is a clinical trial, stuff that's very obvious. I think that's the piece that will be missing. So in terms of the depth of understanding, that shouldn't be any greater, but there'll be more of that there, if that kind of makes sense. And I think that's really where the difference is going to be. So there isn't an expectation, for example, that you now have to have a much deeper understanding of what TRIZ is about, or what failure mode effect is about. So it's not trying to move up into asking level 8 questions at level 7. It's not that. And I think Grace has emphasized there, the examples are really the key. The examples and the application, they're really the key. The more you can come up with those things and put in as many diagrams, examples, that's the thing that will stand to you. All right. Okay, I think we've covered enough. So hopefully that's of kind of use to you. So we're going to finish up this module now. So I don't know if whether there's anything else scheduled on the Wednesdays. I don't know if there is, but if there's anything else, then go to training. So if you get a prompt for a class for this module next week, we obviously won't be having it. You do have the option. Yeah, obviously, I'm only commenting on my own module here now. So obviously, if you have other modules going on, or if you do feel like you need a bit of revision in one of the other modules and you want to say to a lecturer to say, you know, this time is available next Wednesday if you want to do a revision on something, and if you want to say something to a lecturer, by all means do that. You know, so anyway, best of luck with everything. Hope everything works out well for you, and the best of luck with everything. If we don't talk in the meantime, we'll talk probably at graduation, and I will put these notes up on Moodle. I'll do that now later on. So and again, thanks to Ursula there on the side as well. You know, just treat it as it's a normal exam, but the examples are good. All right, folks, take care. We'll talk to you soon, and stay safe. All right, thanks, folks. And again, thanks, Ursula. Okay.